Welcome to Duke Reads. Today we are live from the Gothic Reading Room at Perkins Library on the Duke campus. My name is Frank Stasio. I am the host of The State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, and I'm delighted to be here today moderating this first ever Duke Reads session with a live audience. So congratulations to all of you. It's nice to see you here. This season, faculty selectors have been asked to choose the book that has had a significant impact on their lives. Today we're talking with Tim Tyson, who selected The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Timothy B. Tyson is a senior research scholar at the Center for Documentary Studies. He's visiting professor of American Christianity and Southern Culture in the Divinity School. Tim is the author of the much acclaimed Blood Done Sign My Name, and he has written many other award-winning books. He also co-edited Democracy Betrayed, the Wilmington Race Riot, 1898, and its legacy. That won the 1999 Outstanding Book Award from the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Human Rights in North America. Tim Tyson was a John Hope Franklin Senior Fellow at the National Humanities Center from 2004 to 2005. And he's a North Carolina native, a double graduate of Duke, a master's in 91, a PhD in 94. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Tyson.
Thank you.
Tim, I have a statement here from you about why you chose this book, but maybe you better tell us about the importance
Well, I
of
wonder
this
what
book.
I said.
Well, here's what you said.
What did I say?
Yeah, and was that you? Or is that one of your staff writers?
I'll tell you why, but no, really. I don't know who said that, but I moved into a rooming house in Chapel Hill when I was about 18. And when I moved the bed, a piece of paper fell, and on the paper was typed these words: "One cannot deny the humanity of another without diminishing one's own. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself." James Baldwin, whom I had not heard of. And I went and got The Fire Next Time at a used bookstore, and I've been reading it ever since.
Over and over. Well, let's get to some of the questions then that we're going to ask in our first discussion point of the day. We have 5 points that are chosen by the selector, and we're going to get to those. And we're also interested in your views on the book. And if you haven't read the essay, that's fine. As the discussion goes on, if any questions are raised in your mind, we're happy to take them here today. First question, though, and I'll give this preface because I think the setup is important. James Baldwin, born in Harlem, 1924, began to publish in 1953, and he starts with his now classic novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Though he wrote one book in the 1980s before his death, which was in 1987, his star seemed to rise and fall with the civil rights movement itself. He published Notes of a Native Son in 1955 in the wake of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Next two collections of essays, Nobody Knows My Name, sold 1 million copies in 1961, and the book we're talking about today, The Fire Next Time, sold well over 1 million and landed the author on the cover of Time magazine and appeared to establish him as one of the major voices on the African American liberation struggle. So, Tim, as a historian of that movement, what draws you to this book? What do you take from this essay?
Well, this was a powerful document at the time. It did a great deal to compel America to look at itself in the mirror. But I'm drawn to it not so much as a historian, but just as a citizen, because I find that it speaks to our current predicaments about as clearly as it spoke to the predicaments of 1961 and 1962 and 1963 when Baldwin emerges as one of the leading spokespersons for the movement. For one thing, if you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education, I had no idea that I would be 52 and I would be defending Brown versus Board of Education, apparently for the rest of my life. I had no idea, the cities of destruction, as he calls them, part of this book is about, he says, my father was a Southerner, my mother was a Southerner. If they'd only waited a minute, I would have been born in the South, but I was born in Harlem. But he says, but in some ways, it's a book that's from the South, but it speaks to the tragic failure of the Great Migration to alter the arc of African American history. And I think that the cities of destruction, he called them, are actually far more harsh and hostile and brutal places for children to grow up now than they were then, when this was such a important dilemma in the public mind, thanks in part to Baldwin's testimony. But so it keeps, I don't know if it stays fresh or we just keep having to dig in the same hole so much.
Well, so much has changed, though. How is it that this book is still relevant today when you think about how much has changed since the time that he wrote it?
For one thing, Baldwin really is addressing larger issues of the human spirit, and he's also talking about, not so much the bus or the water fountain, but white supremacy and the scars that it's carved in people's souls, black and white, and the dilemmas of a vastly wealthy nation with these pockets of misery that produce so much damage and so much danger and so much tragic loss. Those are things that didn't start. He could have been writing about, in Dickens' London, he could have been writing about any place on earth in some ways.
And you're right. In so many ways, it doesn't seem so much a critique about the system itself, although it's clear that there are the particulars of what's wrong with a segregated society, with an unjust society. It really does get to that spiritual question and the inability of white privileged Americans to see their privilege, to see themselves and what their privilege means and the ground they're standing on, how they got there.
In fact, that pulls me to a passage which I'm in the beginning. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been best at since we have heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. I find in the world around me a continual refusal to look at what is happening in this country. And that's, I don't want people to, I'm not a purveyor of guilt. I do not wish anyone to wring their hands and feel horrible. It's just seeing what is going on around you and not pretending somehow that it's not, that we don't have, 2 and 3 generations of African American men being ground up in our prison system for a drug war that hasn't worked and that hasn't stopped anything except it's nearly poisoned our country. It is of such titanic proportions that historians are now beginning to study mass incarceration the same way that we've studied, waves of immigration or the Great Migration or the Civil War, big phenomenon. We start to realize that mass incarceration is an enormous thing, and that it's going to be a marker in that these last 30 years are going to be a marker in our history forever because of the devastation that this has perpetrated, and people trying to pretend that we are in a post-racial society and that somehow that the election of an African-American president means that somehow this is not really happening.
Yeah, and the unwillingness to look at some of the structural causes for that. When we see the great disparity in the number of African American students, men especially, who are suspended from school or who are expelled from schools, the disproportion is an outrage, and not to inspect that and say what's going on, because the correlation then between dropout rates and then crime and suspension, all of those are clearly correlated. And it seems that the question doesn't even get raised. Why is this disparity here in the school system, and how are we going to address it? It's simply waved off with zero tolerance policy, and on we go. That's the inability, the unwillingness to look at the ground you're standing on. And yet, and I want you to talk about this, Baldwin never seems to lose hope. From the start to the end, there are lines like this. This is in the letter to his nephew, talking about white folks. You must accept them, and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. We are the hope. We bring hope to these people because of the spiritual bankruptcy that this nation faces. We're the face of its guilt. And until they confront that, it's a hopeless society. How does he not lose hope?
Well, I think he has inhaled the best of our culture. He's deep in the blues and the ironic tenacity of a blues-inflected understanding of the world, where there are no good choices and you're not innocent, and yet as Tom Waits said, two dead ends, and you still got to choose. He with a kind of a humor. He's way down deep in the gospel, where you look the brutal reality of your history in the eye, but then you testify to that burden, but then you reach up and you reach out to community and to the divine, and you transcend your trouble in that way. So he has, Bessie Smith and Muddy Waters all down in him, so deep. In fact, he talks about going to Paris for the first time and hearing the rhythms and inflections of the people that produced me. He says, I heard them for the first time in Paris, sitting over in Paris in a little room with his stack of Bessie Smith records, and being the distance allowing him to actually see his country from afar and yet close up in that way. And I think those are the things that give him such hope. And of course, he saw, he lived through a time of really tremulous hope and agonizing tragedy, but a country that was, forever threatening to actually redeem its democratic vision. And that was a bitter and hard thing, but it was also a really hopeful time. And I think he didn't deny any of it.
Let me offer you this reflection from Joanne. Is the Fire Next Time a period piece? This is part of our question today. Is it still relevant? And Joanne says, this book is not a period piece. It is relevant today. We gain a greater understanding of how it felt to be black in the 60s. The description of blacks' deplorable treatment in World War II is shocking. German POWs were treated with more humanity and dignity than were blacks, although blacks still felt freer in Europe than here in the United States when they returned. We might think of blacks struggling at that time for equality. Instead, Baldwin emphasized the rejection of white characterization of blacks. He also stressed the perspective that blacks in America had about the country's reality that informed them of the attributes that the majority didn't see. I think that's what you're getting at, that there was this aspiration to true democracy and equality that hadn't been met, but was still in the hearts of African Americans and some whites. On page 25, it stated, Negroes are taught to despise themselves. The world is white, they are black. White people hold the power and are superior to blacks. The future you faced was because you were black and for no other reason. We need to understand this and realize why later demonstrations and actions were taken.
Well, there's a lot, Joanne says a lot here. One of the things that strikes me is that I think Baldwin understands that it's not just hatred, but white supremacy that we are all black and white recovering white supremacists, and that this has twisted our view of ourselves and each other, and that we have to, he says, as long as you insist on being white, I guess I will remain black. You know, he understands it takes us decades of sort of high theory explorations of the meaning of how, you know, race is a social, what do they call that thing? There you go, socially constructed. But Baldwin here, you know, 30 and 40 years ahead of the people is understanding that what race is just a language of domination, but it is not an inherent reality. And that he says in another context, I remember coming home from school, and you can guess how young I must have been, and my mother asked me if my teacher was colored or white. And I said she was a little bit colored and a little bit white, because she was about your color. And as a matter of fact, I was right. That's part of the dilemma of being an American Negro, that one is a little bit colored and a little bit white, and not only in physical terms, but in the head and in the heart. And there are days, and this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. How precisely are you going to reconcile yourself to your situation here? And how are you going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here, and that to be here means you can't be anywhere else? I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say.
Talking about James Baldwin's The Fire next time. If you have any questions here, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to entertain any ideas. Yes, sir.
Yes.
One of the things I think that makes the book universal is the palpable, very eloquent sense of fear. Fear that's not, that you don't even learn yourself. Fear that exists before you were even born. Fear, he says, he feels in his mother's love and in his father's touch to inherit that world of palpable fear. Goes beyond the ages and speaks very loudly. I think the other thing, too, is we should pay close attention to the title of this book. Fire and Con. I mean, it's prophetic
Yes.
in many, many ways. I mean,
Yes.
Think what happened after 1963 and on through the rest of the 60s. It's very prophetic. The other thing, I think when he talks about white people, and he holds out this hope, these essays were originally, one of them, I can't remember if it's the long one or the short one, was originally published in New York, read by elite white people. Mm-hmm. I think that may color a bit of that conciliatory tone. I think beneath it, a great deal of rage, huge amount of rage, and
No doubt.
justifiable.
No doubt, no doubt. And he is definitely, you know, his father is a Pentecostal minister, his adopted father. He never knew who his biological father was. His mother wouldn't even tell him his name. And he said she marries when he's 3. And his father is a very harsh Pentecostal minister.
But he outreaches his
And then he becomes a better preacher than his father, you know. And but that sense of the apocalyptic is both inherent, I think, to him in that way, but it is also inherent to our history. You know, we can't. I don't know whether America will become, you know, a great democracy or a monster, a huge death machine. You know, we're born. The country is born at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, where the bodies of millions of Africans settle into the sand, and you know, in this huge death machine of the Atlantic slave trade, you know, where 10 or 12 million people are brought to this part of the world, and 45% roughly die on the way, and are thrown into the ocean. And this is where we begin. It's not something that happens to our country. It is our country. This is the founding place. Down in the abyss is where we're from. We like to think we're from Philadelphia, if there's a difference. But in truth, that's what we've come up out of, and that's apocalyptic. even in a realistic description of it, not in some kind of paranoid fantasy. And then, we've invented these machines that can destroy the whole planet. Frost speculates about whether the world will end in fire or in ice. And I suppose with the rainbow promises it won't be water, and global warming promises it won't be ice. And I suspect, though I hate to think about it, that ethnic hatred and the disparity between starvation and opulence plus nuclear weapons is the end of us. If somebody sees, I'm a happy person, but if somebody sees, that we don't even know where they all are. And they're people who really, really hate us. And
Yes, sir.
yeah,
Can I ask where the title comes from? Is it from a quotation?
it's going. There's several songs, but "It's Gonna Rain" is the one he quotes. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time. Which is,
And there is a sense in that biblical invocation of that apocalyptic vision. I gave you a chance. You're now on your last chance. The flood was the first warning. There are no others. It will be the fire next time. That's powerful. Yeah, it is a powerful title.
and if we're looking at it just as a period piece then, just for a minute, what he's really doing is he's coming to white America, to the readers of the New Yorker, and saying, you're uncomfortable with Martin Luther King. Isn't that special? How about I introduce you to a friend of mine who says you're the devil? And can I say that you're not? I'm having a drink with some devils on the other side of town after we finish this conversation with Elijah Muhammad. But can I really say this is my country? When the young people say, I have no country, I have no flag, can I say, you do? He's trying to say, this could be a lot worse. And indeed, of course, it does get a lot worse. And could have been, and might, the venom of ancient wrong is a dangerous substance, more dangerous than plutonium, I really think. And we've got plenty of it.
He points to the violent separatist solution. He also makes reference to the Christian tradition. Interestingly enough, he has rejected both. He rejected Christianity, in which he was apparently a very successful minister early on in his life, as hypocritical and ineffective. And for Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, he felt that they were a little narrow in their scope. Wow. Talk about his relationship with organized religion.
Well, he speaks of the first, we have the letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation is the first section. Then he talks about growing up in Harlem and his father and the church and how he writes, there was no love in the church. It was a mask for hatred and self-hatred and despair. The transfiguring power of the Holy Ghost ended when the service ended, and salvation stopped at the church door. When we were told to love everybody, I had thought that meant everybody. But no, it applied only to those who believed as we did, and it did not apply to white people at all. I was told by a minister, for example, that I should never on any public conveyance, under any circumstances, rise and give my seat to a white woman. White men never rose for Negro women. Well, that was true enough in the main. I saw his point. But what was the point, the purpose of my salvation, if it did not permit me to behave with love toward others, no matter how they behave toward me? Which is why I would kind of argue with you about whether or not he abandoned Christianity. I would say he abandoned the church, but and he may have abandoned Christianity. But he didn't. I don't think he abandoned the religion of Jesus, as Howard Thurman called it. I find him as being
the church he walked away from. Would you say? I mean, it does feel that his sense of how the church was organized and what was being sold in those pulpits was for him a bromide that wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
And he was no more comfortable at that dinner with Elijah Muhammad.
Well, yeah, clearly. And then, so he's got the relationship with the church. Then he's got Elijah Muhammad. And then he wrestles with the idea of what religion does and does not offer us, and the way that we might wish to escape it, in fact, in order to, not in bitterness, but moving toward love, into something that's, I remember being struck when I was 15 or so, 14 or 15, when I realized that our church was a middle-class country club. We went to church, and then some people took us to the club afterwards one day, and I'd never been to the club. And, they were slicing the roast beef, and we were standing in our line and I realized that the country club was really a lot like church. You had to dress nicely, really, to be acceptably attired there, and people they greeted everyone. You were a member, And that's kind of how things were at church. But the difference between the Methodist church and the country club was that they had more money at the country club, and that the Methodist church was sort of a middle-class country club, and that and that not everybody was welcome by any means, and that the teachings of Jesus were the farthest thing from the sensibility that most people carried through that institution, and that. I don't feel that he, and in the same way, I identify with what he does, because I didn't really, I left that and became a hippie. And I've recently realized that the hippie was a church. We hugged everybody. We loved everybody. We had certain rituals and songs. Perhaps you were there too.
Incense?
We had incense, we did. It had many church. It really was a church. And it was really, and what vision is in that church? It was a Christian church. It was the church of Jesus anyway. It was a church that said, don't worry about clothing, don't worry about possessions, accept people for who they are. Everyone's welcome. It was the church of the big pot. We made big pots of things that everyone could have a bowl, and anyone brought was fine. We wanted the church that we had been led to believe existed when we grew up, and it didn't, so we made another. It was not perfect either, but nonetheless, I think in some ways Baldwin was looking for a bigger church. In fact, he says a bigger-hearted church, a bigger scoped kind of vision of love. But he frequently talks about leaving the church to preach the gospel, and indeed he does become a preacher.
Well, Bill wants to weigh on this. Bill from Raleigh says Baldwin grew up in Harlem at a time when for many black men across America, one way to survive was to immerse themselves in sports, music, or religion. Certainly there were many other areas of accomplishment, but given social restriction, Baldwin was attracted to religion as a vehicle to find himself professionally and socially. Also gave him an opportunity to understand language as a lyrical, allegorical, and metaphorical expression and persuasion. In his writing, he uses his religious background as a means of framing civil rights as a moral imperative, and allowed him to affiliate with King in a sincere and emphatic manner. Religion was an essential component, Bill says, in shaping his worldview and honing his skill as a compelling master of words. Clearly, religion is part of it. I mean, he can't escape it, doesn't want to. He wants to
I think it's a religious vision. I find the whole thing to be a sermon, really. If you get right down to it, even though it's a blues sermon in some ways, and he's willing to look right into the abyss, which is not good. I don't believe that's good for church development, but as we say over at the divinity school. But nonetheless, where can you start? How can you have a genuine religious appreciation of the world if you're not really willing to start in the abyss? Because that's where you've got to come up from. If you're going up from somewhere, you have to own up to it. So,
other thoughts on this question before we move on? Yes, ma'am. Other thoughts then? Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going out into things I know not of, but I've read accounts of visitors, of European visitors to the American continent in the very, very first days. And there's a fear. They're afraid because there's this kind of primitive, there's something awful out there. There's a dark, and I think in some ways blackness from that kind of perspective is very much something projected and something created, something that putting one's own worst impulses onto someone else. The irony of at the turn of the 20th century, the irony of the black beast rapist that is put forth in sort of white political propaganda about disfranchising African Americans, and the irony of calling black men rapists. I mean, look around you. What color are these people? They come in many colors. We're all we're all blood kin, and there's a terrible fear that the mistreatment that has been the fate of black women enslaved by white power gets projected onto. Clearly, that's a projection, as well as a political tool in order to get white men to vote against their own interests.
And there's plenty in the psychological literature and in psychology to speak to this question of what guilt does and how we, when we can't bear it, end up projecting it. And there's a contemporary economist, a Czech economist, Tomáš Sedláček, who has this theory of zombie economics, actually quite amusing and compelling, but it speaks to this. So if you take a look at zombie movies, the two great horror tropes these days are zombies and ghosts. And think about the difference between them. The zombie is the body apart from the soul. And we've developed an economic system, and it certainly goes back to the slave trade, that allows for you to add and accumulate and satisfy the body apart from the soul. And the zombie will hurt you. The zombie comes after you and wants something from you. The ghost is different. The ghost doesn't hurt you. The ghost tends to hang around and haunt you. The ghost is a voice that keeps bothering you, right? But he won't hurt you. And this is the kind of disembodied morality. And we're living in these days where an outsized morality, a super morality, right? Particularly within religious factions, becomes the test of your political correctness and your political fitness, while you operate with this disembodied, soulless economic system. And I think that particular idea that Sedláček offers is an insight into where this guilt, how it works. Other questions, other observations as we...
One of the ways to look for early formulations of these kinds of fears is very accessible with Shakespeare's Othello. It's a brilliant example of, even in 1606 or 7, how racial stereotypes existed at the time and were exploited. The only difference is that, of course, he makes the black man the hero, ruined by a white society, which is a wonderful turn on the way things usually work out. Although he's ruined things, by pure evil. But every racial stereotype we know is there in Othello.
Coming as it did, sort of as this economic theory, now this economic system is beginning to express itself in its full form, right? Around 1607, colonialism is really in full bloom. So, should we talk about the literary style of this? Is it a memoir, in a sense? Is it an essay? What form is this?
I love his use of the autobiographical, because it's not self-indulgent. It is not about the trivia of my life and what I had for lunch, and what we, but he uses his own voice and his own being and his own experience, but it's always in the service of what he's doing. It's always about the work. It's not a compilation. It's not a memoir in this self-obsessed and self-revelatory way that we sometimes practice memoir. He stuck to his knitting. It's not a long book. he's dealing with what he's dealing with, but it gives it a power. I think the voice is deep and personal, and it comes at you that way, and it won't let you go because it's a personally connective kind of language, but it's not about him.
It's deeply revelatory. The idea that you could grow up, when at the beginning of the essay, when he talks about coming of age and all the changes inside him is coming to his sexuality, but also his sense of identity. He's now looking for who he is. And this, crime became real, for example, for the first time, not a possibility, but the possibility. One would never defeat one's circumstances by working and saving one's pennies. One would never, by working, acquire many pennies, and besides, a social treatment accorded even the most successful Negroes proved that one needed, in order to be free, something more than a bank account. The idea of a young man, a very young man, looking at the street corner and saying, this is the only future I have. I can't imagine my children facing that. I can't imagine my children having to think that way. And here's a very bright, scholarly person with quite a future who faced that and felt that. That's a revelation.
And what could be more contemporary? Because, the inner cities of America, the jobs are gone, and they are not coming back. They're not coming back, not under this economic system. There will be the jobs that African Americans left the South to go do in Pittsburgh and Chicago or Cleveland are not there, and they're not coming back. And so a young man looks around his neighborhood and says, and then enters the only line of employment that anyone he's ever known personally has done. And it's a lucrative employment, reasonably lucrative, that kills you. I mean, that's the reality here. And we've turned it into an industry. We hunt them. We hunt them and pin them up, which is a huge industry. If anything, I think it's, that's a real description of the place he grew up, but those places are worse, a lot worse now than they are then. And our determination not to see them and not to think about them is, if anything, deeper.
Here's Joanne's observation. A memoir is described as a record of events written by a person having intimate knowledge of them and based on personal life experiences. At first, one would think that The Fire Next Time is a memoir. Upon further reflection, one might find that although the book is autobiographical, it serves a greater purpose than just being a memoir. Baldwin's trying to express the feelings of others, blacks and whites, and how things appeared and how they really were for the two races. He's setting the stage for love as a means of equalizing the two races. The book encompasses more than Baldwin's autobiography. That's well put.
It's an interesting, this vision of love that's in this book, which pulled me so, and always has. This kinship that is deep down, in spite of the vision of the apocalyptic and the vision of social misery in the cities. But he talks about really the blood kinship between us and how it can't be denied and how it's terrifying as well. In another piece he writes, white Americans need the moral authority of their former slaves, who are the only people in the world who know anything about them, and may indeed be the only people in the world who really care anything about them.
Any other thoughts and observations on that question or anything else?
Before we move on, my favorite piece of Baldwin, which is really not written anywhere, it's on a TV program. He was on, Face the Nation or something with James J. Kilpatrick was on, who was the leading segregationist intellectual, the editor of the Richmond newspaper. And Kilpatrick says, Mr. Baldwin, I can acknowledge that you're an American citizen. That doesn't mean that I want you to marry my daughter. And Baldwin says, you don't care if I marry your daughter. I've been marrying your daughter for centuries. You just don't want me to marry your wife's daughter. You got, it's deep, isn't it? That's deep. And of course, if you grow up in the small town South, you realize that, you know, the black Boones and the white Boones, they even look sort of alike. But of course, white children are not told who they're kin to. I have a friend who just found out about a whole wing of his family. And of course, they all knew about him and his career and his wife and his children and everything about him. They've been following, they're real proud of him, actually. They claim as his kin, but no one ever spoke of it. He did not know until he was 50 that he had a whole raft of relatives, not distant relatives. His grandfather's brother was black. I mean, that's his great uncle, and that whole wing of the family are African American. These people live a mile from each other.
You know, Frederick Douglass make the point that white slave masters continued to sleep with black women, that slavery would disappear because there would be no white, there would be no black. A miscegenated society cannot withstand those kinds of distinctions.
Well,
I do a lot of traveling in the
yeah.
which is a really miscegenated society, believe it or not. And it is illegal there to ask what someone's race is because they don't know.
Yeah, right.
You know, a lot of people have white, black, all sorts of that.
We don't know either, but it seems to me that you know, the important moment here is in the 1660s when the colonial legislatures change, and I think this is the most telling moment in the history of our country in many ways. You know, your patriarchy, I assume you've heard of. You know, people have. It used to be that your status followed your father. The father was the big deal. Johnson is the son of John. You know. But then in the 1660s in America, for that very reason, because they changed it so that your status followed the mother. And that meant, because if they hadn't, then slavery would have, through its social relations and its sexual relations, would have been constantly producing this population of white people that didn't look white and free people that didn't look white, and then, so they had to cut off that, and they made it follow the status would follow the mother, and that way, when a white man had children with a black woman, that produced enslaved black people, and then. But of course, the problem there, the only thing left was the only real problem was what about if a white woman has children with a black man? And so the answer to that was the taboo. And that if a black man so much as seemed to look at a white woman, he could be roasted on a spit. And that was to slam that door shut. And it's all about the economy. That deep taboo that I grew up with. I knew that race and sex were connected because grown-ups talked about them in exactly the same inflection of voice and at the same level of volume. He's black, you know. Anyway, you know, that race and sex were deeply connected, and I knew that when my father would argue with people about race, other white men would say, well, I suppose you want your daughter to marry one. And that was really seen as the argument closing, you know, because what could be more horrible? I remember I had one friend who she was dating a young black man secretly when we were 16, and they sent her away, like to California. She got shipped away by her parents. And I remember somebody else's mother accosted us because we were hanging around in interracial groups, and she was saying, "What would the children look like?" Which we kind of didn't argue with her. And then years later, I thought, what would the children, Beyonce, what would the children look like? What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You're sick in your head.
Let's move. What do you know? I want to ask you one more question. What do you think he made? What do you make of that point he writes, where he says perhaps black people are the only ones who care about we care more about them than they care about themselves. What does that mean?
We're bound to each other. We're bound to each other. I think in some ways that's his. I don't mean it's an answer to the Black Power movement. I mean that before the Black Power movement really took off, he was laying out what is that we are blood kin, and that we're bound to each other. That there is no black without white. If you insist on being white, then I am black, which is actually what Garvey said. Believe it or not, I mean Garvey said, God is not white and God is not black. The angels have no color, but they are not white peaches from Georgia. But if you say that God is white, then I say God is black. It's the same. So Baldwin, who has this vision of universal love, is saying the same thing that Marcus Garvey said, 40 years earlier. Just a demand for the acknowledgement of humanity and of our kinship to one another, which I think he feels very deeply. He sees the yearning that white people have. Even though they're repelled, even though they want to stay on top, even though they fear, there's also this love, if you want to call it that, this deep yearning for the divide to be bridged, for, I think of the white Southerners that I grew up with. My grandmother told us that our slaves loved us so much that when General Sherman's army came, they hid the family silver from the Yankees to keep them from getting it. It was a treasured story for her. She told it to me 20 times. I got older and I started doing family history. I found out we had no slaves. We had no silver. And General Sherman's army came about 150 miles from where the family was. So it was completely, but she was so attached to it. And that was a way of acknowledging that bond. It was also a way of trying to teach me that we weren't the kind of trashy people who were mean to black people. But you see, so it was a class thing too, but it's just complicated, this kind of, Ben Tillman, possibly one of the most vicious white supremacists that the country has ever produced. He put up a monument to old Black Joe, his family, a monument when he became, a monument to his family, this black man that he treasured, of course, his own pet Negro, right? But, as Zora Neale Hurston said, but hated black people in general, and yet he clung to it. And I think that's not, we're just that complicated.
Other thoughts and observations? We may have answered some of this, but let's go to point 5. Let's take a look at 4 in particular and make sure that we've covered it. What holds the disparate narratives together, the two stories, the letter and the essay? How does the story of Baldwin's struggles with his Pentecostal preacher father relate to the episode of Elijah Muhammad? Well, I think we've talked about that.
Yeah, well, I think he actually almost specifically compares his conversation. He looks at Elijah Muhammad and sees his father. And it's the similar religion. To hell with white people. I mean, that's what his father, the Christian minister, believed. His father asked him about the boy he was keeping company with and asked if he was a Christian. And Baldwin said, well, he's Jewish. And his father slapped him. And Baldwin says, he's a better Christian than you are, and leaves the house. But his father's religion, the deepest core of his religion in many ways is to hell with white people. And so Elijah Muhammad, the parallels are obvious, I think. And he's really addressing both of his fathers and trying to look beyond that towards some kind of vision of humanity that's both real and also rooted in love.
Here's Joanne's thoughts on this. In the narrative to his nephew, Baldwin is setting the stage for the rest of his book. He writes to his nephew, "You were born where you were born, in the ghetto. Face the future that you faced because you were black for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. There's no reason for you to try to become like white people. There's no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. You must accept them. You must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. And then I'll go to the last paragraph here. Baldwin visited Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, found how Elijah's followers chanted, "Yes, that's right," a similar response to Pentecostal congregations. Elijah's power came from single-mindedness. He meant what he said. He felt black men needed to accept the true faith and become Islamic. Baldwin states, "I felt I was back in my father's house, and I told Elijah that I didn't care if white and black people married, and that I had many white friends." And this fact parallels his Jewish classmates' friendship and recounts that story as well. And the courage to really get in the car, I think this is one of the, again, these sort of profound moments and an insight into his character, where now they're going to take him wherever he's going, and he's going into the white neighborhood to have drinks with a few of his white friends. "Would you guys mind giving me a lift?" Hop in. Yeah, a pretty powerful statement. What do you make of his? Oh, yes.
What would you think Elijah Muhammad would, or what would Baldwin think right now about the Muslims in comparison to how his feeling was back at that time?
Well, I guess before I really respond, I have to ask what you mean by the Muslims exactly, because I think the Nation of Islam, circa 1961, is a different thing than Islam, world Islam, because they have their own theology, which is, the mad scientist Yaqub created white people, and it's actually there's been a bridge built between the Nation of Islam and traditional world Islam now. But the Nation of Islam really comes out of the American cities in the 1920s, and it's really rooted in black supremacy and the white man as the devil. It has its own theology that's really that's as much rooted in, partly inspired by Japanese horror films, believe it or not, truthfully, and also just inspired by the black experience in America. So it's not exactly the same thing as, world Islam. The Nation of Islam has undergone a lot of changes and turmoil as well. And so it's not really the same. But if I think he's still holding up and would be still holding up, if he was here, a vision of universal love that's close to the heart of Islam and close to the heart of Christianity, if perhaps not as practiced so much, but as intended.
What do you think is Baldwin's place today in the study of civil rights and in our? Do we know him? We certainly don't know him as well as we know other figures of the civil rights movement.
Well, it's too complicated. We don't want to take enough time to. We don't know who we know. Yeah. One of my students published a brilliant book last year called "At the Dark End of the Street: Black Women, Rape and Resistance: A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power," in which her portrait of Rosa Parks is completely different than the one that's been put forward. And it begins with the gang rape of a black woman in Abbeville, Alabama, Reese Taylor, whom we've never heard of Mrs. Taylor, and how the investigator from the NAACP goes up to Abbeville and interviews everybody and collects the information about this terrible crime. And the investigator's name is Rosa Parks. And she organizes the committee to defend Mrs. Reese Taylor. And this is, if you look at the people who are on the letterhead of the committee to defend Mrs. Reese Taylor, it's the Montgomery Improvement Association in its first rendition, 1944. So it's 11 years. Martin Luther King's in high school. It's not, and this is the organization. And she finds a series of these rape cases where white men are raping black women, and then the committee to defend Gertrude Perkins and the committee to defend Viola White is the same committee that was the committee to defend Mrs. Reese Taylor. And Rosa Parks is at the thick of it. She's an anti-rape, anti-sexual assault activist, black women organizing to defend their own personal dignity. That's not part of the Montgomery bus boycott. It's not in the story. It's not in our history. And it's very, very important. And that's, it cuts down to the roots of this inhumanity that's really at the heart of, our identity. Sex and violence is right at the who we are and what we can endure. It's really a very, very important thing. And we don't even know the things we know we don't think we know. That's a different Montgomery bus boycott than the one we know. And that's a familiar story, let alone the stories we don't know and that haven't been told. So.
And Baldwin makes us very uncomfortable still, I would guess.
And what also, you see, we like to divide things up in nice, we have Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and clearly Baldwin partakes deeply, of both of those kinds of visions. They're not separate visions. There's a demand to have our common humanity acknowledged, but and he's not sure. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, he's with King, but the rage is strong. So it's.
Tim, always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Frank.
Thank all of you as well. Thanks so much for participating in Duke Reads. Tim Tyson, our next Duke Reads is a live conversation here at Duke Perkins Library, Professor Melissa Maloof, and we will remember Reynolds Price with his book, A Serious Way of Wondering, The Ethics of Jesus Imagined. That's going to be live, 4 o'clock, Friday, January 27th, 2012. In the meantime, enjoy great Duke programming every Thursday at noon with Duke office hours. And if you want to view today's program again, it's going to be available at Duke On Demand or through the Duke Reads website at DukeReads.com. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.